I want to thank, this is a tremendous turnout. Thanks so much. I'm sorry to all you people who will have to exit when the fire marshal discovers what we've done in here. But until he does, or she does, we'll proceed with this. We're scheduled for an hour. It's quite possible the Q&A will go longer. I understand that especially those of you who are standing will filter out when you're tired of standing, and that's perfectly fine and appropriate. I waited 6 months to do a talk here at the laboratory on the book, largely on the hope that you would all go buy the book first, and thus I could reap tremendous royalties which come with publishing with an academic press. I checked my Amazon.com standing before coming here, and I've cracked into the top 400,000 books sold on Amazon.com. Yeah, that's a big accomplishment, I think. Thank you. It is a beautifully colored book, you know, baby blue. Should remind you of peace. Nice bomber on the front, though. Stanford University Press, available online. They're selling it at a discount now. That's a bad sign for me. But what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then what some of the main arguments are and how it's been received. The why goes back to 2007, when the Congress began to look forward to the post-George W. Bush incoming administration and had just voted down RRW, had voted down RNEP, had voted down this, had voted down that, and didn't have a strong sense that the Bush administration actually had a nuclear strategy, and observed that the nuclear deterrence community in the United States had fallen into two sharp camps that hate each other, don't speak the same language, don't ever test each other's assumptions, and the Congress was stuck. And politically, we as a nation were at a dead end on making policy in the nuclear area. And the Congress said, it charged the new administration at that point with conducting a nuclear posture review, but at the same, and it directed that it would be very broad in character, interagency in character with DoD in the lead, but broad. It wouldn't just touch on force structure or deterrence strategy. It would look at all of the different elements of arms control, nonproliferation, strategic stability, nuclear counterterrorism, nuclear nonproliferation, deterrence, assurance, extended deterrence, all of that. And at the same time, 2008 National Defense Authorization Act said, we, the Congress, need to be better consumers of the next administration's nuclear policy and strategy. And we need to understand where there's the possibility of getting some business done here, politically. And so they created a bipartisan commission, the Commission on the Future of the U.S. Strategic Posture, Bill Perry, chair, Jim Schlesinger, vice chair, 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans, and they asked them 2 simple questions. Is there anything you can agree about? And if so, what? Their answer was almost no. I mean, literally there was a moment in the deliberation of the commission when they went home at the end of the day with a tentative conclusion that there would not be a report, that there was nothing they could agree. Lo and behold, there was a report, and I had a hand in that as scribe, no other role. But many of the people from that process came into the Obama administration. Ash Carter, Michelle Flournoy, Jim Miller, myself, and I got the tag to be, well, Michelle Flournoy and Jim Miller figured, well, you sort of just wrote a nuclear posture review insofar as I drafted the commission's report. I could easily do a nuclear posture review report. Well, that was a 7-ring circus, and that's another story. But the problem that we then encountered as an administration was that the middle we tried to create and govern from didn't really exist politically. That we still, in everything we did, encountered the 2 camps. Following a recommendation of the Strategic Posture Commission, the Obama administration went off and negotiated a New START agreement. So the arms control agreement that would replace START, which was due to expire early in the Obama term, so that we'd have some verification and strategic predictability while we worked on a more transformative approach to our strategic military relationship. That draft treaty had the support of every former Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, all but one former STRATCOM commander, and was fundamentally opposed by the Republicans in the Senate. It only passed with a bare minimum necessary to do so. This highly illustrated the point that the conservative end of the spectrum that the Posture Commission had tried to bring in really wasn't ready to come into a consensus. And similarly then, as we began the process of trying to confront the modernization dilemmas then long deferred by the Bush administration and dumped in our inbox in 2009, what we clearly found was that the NGO community was willing to go to the mat on every single modernization topic as inconsistent with the Prague vision. So we had this experience of trying to govern from the middle, a middle painted by a bipartisan commission. I would say at the end of the 8-year experience of the Obama administration, I shouldn't use the we word anymore, having been at Livermore now 13 months, I'm not a part of the Obama administration, but the administration can take some credit for having recreated a bit of a middle. We have support for arms control, we have support for nuclear modernization, we've increased funding for the weapons complex every year, 8 years in a row. And that required bipartisan support. This support is neither broad nor deep. You can't call this a bipartisan consensus. What you can say is we have enough political agreement to get the business of the nation done, at least with the current administration and the current Congress. And all questions are up for grabs this coming year. So that's the backdrop, was the experience of trying to govern from the middle, finding the two camps fighting us tooth and nail at every opportunity, and then coming to the realization that there were actually a couple of testable propositions in the arguments made by basically the Gang of Four, the group that came together in 2008 in reaction to the George W. Bush administration's nuclear policy and posture. Bill Perry, Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, who in a series of 5 op-eds over 5 years set out an agenda on the argument that more can be done now to further reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal, that we can lay the foundations for others to join us in this process of reductions, and more than that, that we can transform our approach to deterrence and military strategy in such a way as to really fundamentally alter out of the equation the nuclear part of our military posture. These are testable propositions, and if you will, the experience of the Obama administration was to go test them, to run the experiment. And thus we said in the report of the Nuclear Posture Review that the implementation of the Prague vision, that was a long-term project. But on the 8 to 10 year time frame of an Obama administration policy strategy, there were a number of specific conditions that we wanted to create. We wanted to, of course, reverse the nuclear program of North Korea, work with Russia to accomplish significantly deeper reductions, recognizing the reality that both Washington and Moscow are nervous about coming down while China's coming up. We wanted some assurances out of China that it was committed to a cap on its program of some nebulous kind, and that it was committed to the practice of nuclear transparency that the other P4 states engage in. We wanted to halt Iran's nuclear program, and we wanted to work with our allies to test how far we could go in removing the nuclear part of the extended deterrence umbrella. And the story of the book then is to go through this experience. First of all, the opening chapter, if you read any of the book and only read one chapter, read the first chapter, because it's the history of U.S. nuclear policy and posture from the Cold War to today. And what it argues is that there are elements of both continuity and change over this time. A lot more continuity than many people would think, but also a lot of important change. One of the key elements of continuity has been every president has come in and said, why do I need all this stuff? Why have I still got all these nuclear weapons? Why have I still got the triad? Why are things still on alert? Why can't I embrace minimum deterrence? And lo and behold, they've all sort of worked themselves to the same place. That's a key element of continuity. But the next few chapters then go through the experience of the administration and working to try and accomplish those conditions that I set out. Of course, the chapter on North Korea doesn't have much to say about the conditions we were successful in creating. Here's a significant new military problem. Shorthanded is the Austin, Texas problem. And if you haven't seen, you may remember the rattling of nuclear sabers over Korea about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, when we flew a nuclear-capable bomber in to the region. And North Korea responded with two pieces of propaganda. One was a video of a young North Korean man sleeping and dreaming being picked for the mission to go drop nuclear bombs on Manhattan and flying the North Korean bomber to Manhattan, and fire and death and destruction, and then home, sleeping, great hero. The other piece was of propaganda was of the North Korean leader receiving his briefing from his STRATCOM equivalent team in front of his targeting board, which showed North Korean nuclear-tipped ICBMs coming into American cities, including, perplexingly, Austin, Texas. But that's the image he wants us to have, that our cities are now at risk, and that he's capable of taking America hostage by nuclear weapons. Go on and look at the story with Russia. Pretty straightforward. Reset only got us so far, and on arms control it got us into New START, but not beyond New START to the envisioned additional 1/3 reduction. President Obama will go down in history as the president to have accomplished the fewest nuclear reductions of any president since Jimmy Carter, and is roundly attacked by the NGOs accordingly. There is a chapter on China. The Obama administration's starting point for accomplishing the objective of some restraint and transparency in the nuclear area by China was simply an offer, a request for a dialogue, an official dialogue, with the hope that over time we might come to some common views of strategic stability and how to protect it. And this would allow China to be comfortable in making some enhanced restraint. How many dialogues have we had with Russia with China on strategic stability? 0. Not interested. This is a little perplexing. Twice in the last 15 years, China's president has made a commitment to nuclear dialogue as a part of a summit agreement with the U.S. counterpart, and China's military has never seen it as necessary to make good on this commitment. And of course, in working with allies, many of our allies really don't care what happens to the nuclear umbrella. And there are some who reasonably ask, isn't this just a Cold War vestige that's left over in Europe that really was for a world that's gone by? And we found a lot of ambivalence and ambiguity among our allies about the role of nuclear weapons and extended deterrence today. This is often mischaracterized as, well, Germany thinks one way and the Poles think another, when in fact this ambivalence about nuclear weapons exists within every country. On the one hand, we all want to be sure that political strategies are being used to reduce nuclear dangers, but at the same time that military measures are robust enough to deter nuclear threats. That was the core idea, by the way, of the Strategic Posture Commission finding, was that the policy and strategy that could enjoy bipartisan support is one that combines political and economic tools to reduce nuclear dangers and eliminate them over time, with military means to deter them so long as threats remain. Our allies love that message in the Strategic Posture Commission and in the Nuclear Posture Review Report. They want to know that we are doing everything possible. The Japanese, quintessentially this, wanting the full use of American diplomatic and military political power to eliminate the nuclear dangers to them. South Koreans as well. This is how the South Koreans became the host to the second Nuclear Security Summit. But they also want to know that deterrence is going to work. You know, Kim Jong-un likes to target Austin, Texas, but he is very clear that the first target, if he ever has to employ a nuclear weapon, is Tokyo. Says it over and over again. What's the reason? Well, the conventional defense of South Korea, if it ever has to happen, would be conducted in large measure with military forces sitting at 8 bases in Japan that fly the United Nations flag. They would have to be moved out of Japan and over to the peninsula. Their release requires the approval of the Japanese Prime Minister. That was a no-brainer in the 1950s. And Kim Jong-un is trying to make really sure it's a brainer today. That Tokyo would understand the risks it would be accepting in allowing the dispatch of these forces. On the one hand, the Japan of Hiroshima wants to know how deeply committed America is to the ultimate abolition goal. And on the other hand, it wants to know how deeply committed we are to using nuclear weapons on their behalf if the shooting actually starts. So we didn't find a lot of latitude among allies. We found a lot of interest in how to enhance deterrence with non-nuclear means, but not a lot of interest in finally and definitively eliminating a role for nuclear weapons. So there are essentially two main arguments that follow from this experience of the administration. The first is the most obvious one, that the conditions don't exist. If you catalog the conditions that the global zero movement says exist today, and then do a sort of reality check from an Obama administration perspective of trying to create those conditions, they don't exist. North Korea is not willing to abandon its nuclear deterrent. Russia is not willing to go further at this time, and for the foreseeable future, it's sort of going the opposite direction, certainly on the INF Treaty. China is not embracing nuclear transparency or restraint. It's modernizing and expanding and diversifying its arsenal. The need for the nuclear umbrella is sharper, is clearer than ever. So these conditions do not exist. That's a pretty blunt statement for people who have built a large house on the argument, on the foundation that they do exist. This leaves us with a question then. Do we unilaterally take additional steps of our own to further reduce the role and number of nuclear weapons in our strategies, regardless of the external environment? And there's an increasingly vociferous camp for doing so, Secretary Perry being in the lead. Don't do LRSO, don't need it, redundant, strategically destabilizing, too darn expensive, and dangerous for us to have this many nuclear weapons, so we can reduce the danger by getting rid of our own nuclear weapons. I think that's a bad argument, and I'm happy to make the case for why that's so. And on what's the implication for arms control strategies with Russia? Well, there are plenty of people who say, well, we should just walk away from arms control with Russia. Russians aren't interested. Why should we be? Well, it's sort of too early to tell, really. Russia doesn't have to put its final arms control cards on the table until a new START is expiring, 2021, or it can be extended once for 5 years by mutual consent. So we may not know really Russia's bottom line on the next arms control deal until 10 years from now. And that's a god-awful long time for the American arms control community to wait. And it's in the Russians' interest to just sit back and see, how do we keep sweetening the pot? Because that's our way. The other main argument in the book is that this survey of the thinking of other countries about nuclear weapons provides the key insight into the role of nuclear weapons in our strategy. And this is an argument that some of you have heard me make in a separate talk here, but about the three countries that might plausibly trip across the red lines in our nuclear declaratory policy are North Korea, Russia, and China. Our declaratory policy says that the fundamental role of nuclear weapons in our strategy is to deter nuclear attack, but that's not the sole purpose of them. We have these weapons and we consider their use, would consider their employment in the extreme circumstance when the vital interest of the United States or an ally is in jeopardy. And who can put our vital interests or those of our allies in jeopardy in a fundamental way? It's those three countries at this time. They have each clearly, well, not the North Koreans clearly, that's an overstatement. Russia and China have clearly set out a strategy for dealing with us. And the North Koreans are sort of amplifying their own. The Russians and Chinese use the exact same expression for defining the problem they face at the center of their defense strategy, which is the problem of deterring and defeating a conventionally superior, nuclear-armed major power and its allies. Their problem is that we can out-escalate them if we choose to do so. We can win in any conflict over vital interests where we choose to pay the price to do so. They have to figure out how to get us to de-escalate if a conflict starts to escalate. They have to satisfy themselves that their strategy is more effective than ours. And it's in the clear interest of all three of these countries to set out as much of this thinking as possible to us so that we understand the confidence they have in their deterrence strategies. And there's a striking symmetry of ideas in the work of these three countries. They write about first creating if there's conflict, well, let me put it this way. So some of you have heard me use the word theory of victory. There's a Cold War term, late 1970s, debate about the Soviet Union. The old guys and gals in the room will remember Harold Brown famously saying, "We build, they build. We stop, they build." What are they doing? And the question in 1977, 8, and 9 became, do the Soviets really have a theory of victory of nuclear war, that they think they could go out and fight a big nuclear war and actually win it? What would that mean? Or do they think they have a theory of war in Europe that would never go nuclear, that they could win because of their nuclear shadow? What's their theory of victory? And if they have one, shouldn't we have one? That was the debate, and it was essentially never settled, and the Cold War ended, and we stopped thinking about it. And these three countries have theories of victory. They're theories of victory in two senses, Clausewitz and Sun Tzu. Clausewitz, if your view of war is that it's a continuation of politics by other means, then what's victory? Victory is not that moment when you've vanquished your enemy on the battlefield. It's when you've created the situation where your enemy chooses to capitulate. You've brought the conflict to a, quote, culminating point where your enemy is willing to do your political bidding, accept your conditions for peace. And I think these three countries have a theory of victory in the spirit of Clausewitz that is built around the following main ideas. Create a conventional fait accompli very quickly, so that we, the United States, and our allies then face the big decision of trying to reverse it or not. Grab Estonia, sue for peace. Grab Taiwan, sue for peace. Encircle Seoul, don't attack Seoul. Encircle Seoul, sue for peace. What do we do? Well, lots of war gamers say we wouldn't choose to run those risks. That's not the politics of it anymore today. So that's their first idea. Create a fait accompli at the conventional level of war. What if we then still were not deterred and we start to get our act together? Well, scare our allies away. Kim Jong-un's strategy, put the crosshairs on Tokyo. Russia's strategy, could elaborate further. What if we still come? Well, anti-access area denial strategies impose a cost on us as we begin to deploy and increase the fear of our allies that they're going to pay a terrible price in an escalating conflict and constrain the overall operation. What if we still come? Well, up the ante with other strategic tools. Long-range conventional strikes on allied capitals, non-kinetic means of enduring financial and other consequence, and of course the possibility of nuclear strikes. Russia's the clearest about escalate to de-escalate. Escalate to de-escalate in Russian strategy is not a nuclear strategy, it's a general strategy of which nuclear is a component. Russia has set out very thoroughly. Russia's military doctrine says there are 3 levels of war: strategic, regional, local. Nuclear plays a role in all 3. Cyber plays a role in all 3. Conventional strike plays a role in all 3. Information operations plays a role in all 3. But the role of nuclear in the middle realm here, in the regional conflict, is to threaten NATO with unacceptable, as opposed to irreversible and unbearable, nuclear consequences. Irreversible and unbearable, that's the strategic level. So, a set of ideas in this theory of victory that these 3 countries have for prevailing in the Clausewitzian sense. Now, what about Sun Tzu? I don't think any of these 3 countries want to go to war against the United States or our allies. What they really love is that we capitulate without ever putting up a fight. And the form of capitulation would not be necessarily very overt. It would simply be that we recognize that we choose to no longer defend the interests that they're contesting, and that our allies recognize that and they begin to cut a different deal. Now, key to the credibility, so you have to think, here are these weaker powers thinking about how do they escalate in a conflict against us. They've got all this confidence. What could explain this confidence? They make 2 further arguments. That there is an asymmetry of stake and geography that plays to their advantage. Asymmetry of geography. We can't defend the Baltics without attacking Russian territory. We can't defend Taiwan without attacking the mainland. That opens up, that makes pretty credible their threat to attack our allies and our homeland. Asymmetry of stake. This was best illustrated by General Yao Yu, a partner of ours in the Track 1.5 unofficial nuclear dialogues we do with China. She's a general PhD, very interesting person. And she said, look, we understand in a war over Taiwan, your interests would be very important. Your reputation as a guarantor, the values you say you defend, your role in East Asia, your credibility. Very important. What would our interests be? She asked. Well, sovereignty and the role of the party remaining in power. Would those be really important or would they be vital? She asked. Well, in their eyes, clear asymmetry of stake, lending credibility to their threats to escalate and stripping credibility away from the credibility of our threats. Are we willing to run that risk over interests that are darned important but not quite vital? So I think the evidence is pretty good that these 3 countries have thought this way, set out these ideas, built their forces, built their organizations, defined their organizational concepts. They're exercising these capabilities every day from Russia into not quite every day from China. Begs the question, what's our theory of victory? How do we think we can, in both the spirit of Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, stand up to these threats and do what we think is right and necessary in the circumstance and safeguard the regional orders that we're trying to safeguard? And I argue in the book that we do have a theory of victory. I'm being a little generous. The focus of military innovation of the United States since 9/11 has been first counterterrorism and then counterinsurgency. We've only in the last 2 years had our leadership wake up to, quote, the third offset. I mean, the basis of the third offset is the recognition that as we come out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we realize now that a handful of potential adversaries have been studying our way of war and our allies' way of war and looking for the strengths we would bring to bear in war against them and the weaknesses and how to exploit these to their advantage. That's the core impetus to all this new thinking about third offset. So do we have a theory of victory? Well, mostly our thinking falls back on deterrence, and deterrence will work, and we're the strongest country. And if the nature of the problem is that they've got to deter us because we're the stronger, then the solution's in the problem. I've heard that argument many times. And I've heard arguments from people in the Pentagon that, well, escalation really isn't very complicated for us as the stronger power because they can escalate to any level of their choosing, and we can just go one higher. And Yao Yunju would ask, are you really willing to do that? Is that, you have the technical capability, but is that what your interests would actually lead you to do in war? I like the Chinese argument about their strategy. It's not a deterrent strategy, it's a counter-deterrent strategy. They are expecting us to deter them, and they have to have a credible capacity to do what they think is right and appropriate in the circumstance, despite our threats and our capabilities and our potential attacks. That sort of points us in the right direction, I think, in terms of developing a theory of victory of our own. What we need to do is counter the confidence that these leaders take that they've got this all figured out, that the costs they would run in a conflict with us would be bearable, that the costs they could impose upon us would be significant in our eyes, and that the risks they would run are calculable and bearable. And we can start to pick at each of these pieces of this equation, and we don't do that first and foremost with nuclear weapons. These three, I mean, remember my shorthand summary of Russia's thinking about integrated strategic deterrence. You use all the tools available to you, military and non-military, kinetic and non-kinetic, nuclear and non-nuclear, offense and defense. You use all of these things across all levels of war to shape the thinking of your enemies. We need a concept of integrated strategic deterrence. We've been talking around one as a community, as a part of the strategic planning process here. We can't meet the whole integrated strategic deterrence strategies of Russia, China, and North Korea with just our nuclear toolkit. Nuclear toolkit's not credible for a lot of the for threatening in retaliation for a lot of the things they might do. There's a huge demand in our strategy for non-nuclear means of strike, including non-kinetic means, for enhanced protection measures, but also, of course, a continuing role for nuclear weapons. And when we think about the continuing role of nuclear weapons, we tend to go to their role at the strategic level of conflict. Remember the Russian catechism, strategic, regional, local. We tend to think about nukes up here, which we better keep doing. Mr. Putin said we won't ever have strategic nuclear war because we Russians have kept our nuclear powder dry. We should keep our nuclear powder dry for the strategic level of conflict so that nobody really ever thinks they can safely transition a war up to that level. But that's not to finish the thinking about the role of nuclear weapons in our strategy. A significant part of the role of nuclear weapons in our strategy is to assure our allies, is to keep them, when Tokyo's in those crosshairs, when Poland's in those crosshairs, they need to know that we are capable of credibly threatening nuclear retaliation in their defense. They, by the way, tend not to see the threat of U.S. nuclear retaliation with strategic forces for an attack on them as credible. Why would America start launching ICBMs out of Montana for a single 1 kiloton weapon going off in the waters near South Korea? Why would we open up the American homeland to the threat of retaliation? Why isn't there some local theater capability to do this job? So there's an assurance and a deterrence argument about the non-strategic piece of our toolkit. Let me make a gross overgeneralization. In the Cold War, extended deterrence came and went as a problem in our nuclear strategy. And after the Cold War, we just forgot about extended deterrence. We immediately brought home all of our nuclear weapons from East Asia. And in the first decade after the Cold War, we brought home 97% of our non-strategic weapons from Europe. So you could grossly misgeneralize and say we only have 3% of the extended nuclear deterrent we had in 1990. But if you take my argument about the theory of victory of these three countries, they're putting our allies, right? These are regional wars. If there's a pathway to U.S. nuclear employment, it's not because someday the president wakes up and discovered that one of these three countries has out of the blue launched a major strategic attack on the American homeland. No, well, because some regional conflict has started to go badly for the actor that started it, who miscalculated in some way and has tripped across red lines in our declaratory policy. Now there's a question of what we do. And this puts the extended deterrence question in the very center of our nuclear strategy today, rather than at the margins. And we don't extend deterrence to our allies just with nuclear weapons. We do it with missile defense, with conventional strike, with conventional forces, with a lot of joint operations, but the nuclear piece remains key. And thus, when we debate whether or not to keep the LRSO in the modernization program, this should be debated in part through the filter of what impact does this have on extended deterrence and the assurance of our allies and the deterrence of regional challengers. Similarly for the rest of the toolkit. Part of my argument is the B-61 is the most strategic capability, the B-61 and DCA fleet, the most strategic capability we have in this strategic environment, because it's the one that does the most potent signaling of the willingness of our allies to stand with us to run these risks. And this is an anathema to the way many people think about this. So those are the main arguments in the book, the background to the book. In the 6 months since it was released, lots of interest, not too many purchases. And of course, if you take my view that there are these two camps, the book's not really written for the two camps. These two camps have made up their minds. They think they know everything they need to know about nuclear weapons, and they've known it for a long time. I'm trying to find that middle and give it some grist for the mill. Now, if you were in the business of writing book reviews, who's going to be writing them? Not those guys. The two camps. So the book has not been warmly embraced. The Arms Control Today has a review in the current issue, which is, depicts me as a nuclear retrograde thinker with some particularly wacky ideas about deterrence, and doesn't mention any of the political and arms control part of the book. And similarly, I had the wire brushing by a Heritage Foundation reviewer who said, "My God, Obama policy stinks, but this book isn't half bad." And I had a former student who published a review who captured the spirit of the thing exactly, I thought. She has the experience as a 30-something-year-old trying to make her way as a newcomer in our community and constantly finding herself in sort of snide and nasty debates with one side or the other and wondering where the heck the middle is in this discussion and eager to have one and eager to play a role in creating one in her own career. So with that, let me thank all of you who've remained standing. I don't see anybody who's slipped away.